There is a mountain on the northern border of North Korea that the regime has spent 70 years turning into a religion. Paektu is not merely terrain, it is the foundational myth of the Kim dynasty, the birthplace of the revolution in the official history, the sacred ground from which Korean destiny flows, the mountain whose name appears in the national anthem, and whose volcanic crater lake appears on the national seal. It is also, underneath the mythology, a geological formation of granite and basalt that extends more than 2 kilometers below its summit, and that, for the last 20 years, has been systematically excavated into the most densely hardened underground military infrastructure on the Korean peninsula. The regime chose Paektu for the same reason it chose everything else, because the symbolism was useful, and because granite that deep does not negotiate with weapons that were not built specifically to reach it. The facility that existed beneath the southwestern slope of the Paektu Massif was not a single installation. It was a network, a series of interconnected tunnels and hardened chambers that the Korean People's Army Corps of Engineers had carved over 2 decades using techniques refined from decades of underground construction experience that made North Korea's tunnel warfare capability the most extensive of any military on Earth. The primary chamber, designated in the target package by a coordinate string that was more honest than any name could be, housed the assembly and maintenance infrastructure for the regime's most capable ballistic missile systems. The class of weapons that had crossed the threshold from regional threat to intercontinental concern, the systems that could reach not just Seoul and Tokyo, but at their demonstrated maximum range, the continental United States. The chamber also housed the mobile launcher fleet that moved those weapons to their firing positions when the order came. Not all of it, enough of it that eliminating the chamber would set the operational timeline back by a margin that the intelligence community assessed conservatively as between 3 and 5 years. 3 to 5 years was the number that moved the decision from theoretical to actionable. The target folder had been building for 4 years. It was built from satellite imagery that captured surface activity patterns over thousands of passes, from signals intelligence that mapped the electromagnetic signatures of the facility's power systems and communications infrastructure, from human reporting that established the facility's internal layout, with a precision that required sources whose identities will be protected for longer than any document classification period currently in use. The geological survey that established the rock density profile above the primary chamber. The survey that made it possible to compute a fuzing solution for a weapon that had to travel through 2 kilometers of mountain before reaching its target, was conducted over 18 months using seismic monitoring data from a network of sensors that appeared on their surface documentation to be part of an academic earthquake research program. The sensor network was not part of an academic earthquake research program. It was part of the target folder, and when the folder was complete, it contained a fuzing solution that the engineers assessed with 91% confidence would place the detonation of a GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator at the correct depth to compromise the primary chamber's structural integrity. 91%. The 9% was acknowledged, documented, and accepted. The decision was made. The mission that was assembled around that 9% was not a single aircraft package. It could not be. The target depth required 2 sequential weapon strikes, the first to open a penetration channel through the upper rock formation, the second to follow that channel to a depth that the first weapon's fuse could not reach unassisted. 2 strikes meant 2 weapons. 2 weapons meant 2 aircraft, or 1 aircraft, making 2 passes over the most heavily defended airspace in East Asia. The planners chose 2 aircraft. They also chose to surround those two aircraft with a support architecture that represented the largest single coordinated electronic warfare and intelligence operation conducted in the Pacific Theater in 2 decades. An operation whose existence could not be acknowledged, whose participants would not be publicly identified, and whose success would be measured not by what was announced, but by what stopped appearing in the imagery analysts' monthly reporting. The regime's air defense network over the Paektu region was not the same network that protected Pyongyang. Pyongyang's defenses were dense, layered, and oriented toward the political calculus of protecting the capital from the threat that the regime used to justify its existence. The Paektu network was different in character. It was oriented toward concealment as much as defense, designed not merely to engage incoming threats, but to avoid presenting the electromagnetic signatures that would confirm the facility's existence to the reconnaissance platforms that the regime knew were watching. The primary long-range coverage came from 2 KN-06 batteries positioned on the ridgelines east and west of the access road network, their radars operating on a reduced duty cycle that minimized detectable emissions while maintaining enough coverage to cue the shorter-range systems. Inside that outer ring, a layered architecture of point defense systems covered the specific terrain features that the underground facilities planners had identified as the approach vectors most accessible to low observable aircraft. The network had been designed with American stealth platforms in mind. This was not an assumption. It was a documented planning parameter that the intelligence community had recovered from a facility document 3 years before the mission. They had designed against stealth. They had not designed against stealth, supported by an electronic warfare package built specifically to address what they had designed. The 2 B-2 Spirits launched from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam at 9:47 p.m. and 9:55 p.m. respectively, an 8-minute interval that separated their radar signatures while keeping them within datalink range of each other for the duration of the flight. The total distance from Guam to the release point over the Paektu Massif was 2,100 miles. At the cruise parameters required for a penetrating strike mission, that distance produced a flight time of just under 5 hours to the initial point, shorter than the transcontinental missions that characterize the longer-range B-2 operations, but compressed in a way that offered less margin for the crew rest cycles and cognitive management protocols that defined extended duration performance. 5 hours was close enough to the edge of the optimal performance window that the flight surgeons had flagged it in the pre-mission physiological briefing. The crews would arrive at the most demanding phase of the mission, the penetration, the weapons release, the threat response window, at approximately 4 hours and 40 minutes of flight time, which placed them inside the first degradation band of sustained vigilance performance. The flagging was noted. The mission was unchanged. The performance band was a statistical description of a population. The individuals flying the mission had been selected because they sat at the tail of that distribution. The pilot of the lead aircraft had flown 23 extended duration B-2 sorties over 9 years. He had developed over that time a quality of attention that he could not easily describe to anyone who had not done the same thing. Not concentration, which implies effort, but a kind of settled awareness that required no effort to maintain and that he could sustain for longer than any laboratory test of human attention had measured. His co-pilot was 11 years younger and had done this 7 times. The difference between 7 and 23 was not visible in their checklists. It was visible in the way they sat in the aircraft during the transit phase, the younger aviator managing his energy with visible deliberateness, the pilot simply present in the cockpit the way a piece of furniture is present in a room, without effort, without drama, permanently, At 1:23 a.m., the lead B-2 crossed into North Korean airspace on the western approach corridor that the mission planners had selected after 6 months of modeling the KN-06 radar coverage against the B-2's signature at every possible approach angle. The corridor was not a gap. The North Koreans had built their coverage specifically to eliminate gaps. The corridor was a vector through the coverage at which the combination of the B-2's reduced radar cross-section and the electronic warfare support package created a detection probability the planners had assessed as operationally manageable, a phrase that, in context, meant the crews had accepted the residual risk and the mission had been authorized despite it. The electronic warfare support came from 2 EEA-18G Growler flights operating from Osan Air Base in South Korea and from the carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, positioned in the Sea of Japan. The coordination between the 2 Growler elements had been rehearsed 4 times in the preceding month using a stand-in target that replicated the KN-06's emission parameters, and that was located in a range complex where the rehearsals could be conducted without the North Korean signals intelligence network, observing the specific frequency management techniques being practiced. The rehearsals had produced a timing protocol, a sequence of jamming activations and power transitions across the different frequency bands of the North Korean air defense network that would create a coherent suppression effect across the entire Paektu approach sector during the 3-minute window required for weapons employment. The timing protocol began at 1:19 a.m., 4 minutes before the penetration corridor crossing, as planned. It survived contact with the actual North Korean network for 2 minutes and 14 seconds before encountering the complication that the rehearsals had not replicated. The KN-06 battery on the eastern ridgeline, the one whose duty cycle the intelligence assessment had characterized as reduced and predictable, was not operating on a reduced duty cycle at 1:19 a.m. It was operating at full power on an unscheduled activation that had begun at 1:09 a.m., when the battery commander, acting on a standing order that required random full-power activations on a schedule set by a randomization process that the signals intelligence community had assessed as predictable, but that had, on this occasion, produced a timing interval that fell outside the predicted range. The battery was fully active. Its coverage was full. The jamming protocol that the Growlers were executing had been optimized for a reduced duty cycle target. Against a full power target, the protocol was providing 68% suppression instead of the 92% that the planning assessment had established as the minimum acceptable threshold. The Growler EW officer on the lead aircraft registered the discrepancy at 1:21 a.m. when the jamming effectiveness monitor showed coverage falling below threshold. He had 2 options available to him in the time he had to make the decision. He could increase power output on the KN-06 frequency band by drawing down coverage on the point defense layer inside the corridor, or he could transmit a datalink alert and request the carrier-based Growler element to reallocate from their assigned sector. The carrier element reallocation would take 40 seconds minimum, 40 seconds with 68% suppression on the primary long-range radar was 40 seconds during which the B-2 was inside the KN-06's coverage at a detection probability that he calculated in the time available as somewhere between 18 and 22% per sweep. The radar rotated every 4 seconds. In 40 seconds, that was 10 sweeps. He did not complete the probability calculation. He increased power output on the KN-06 band and accepted the degraded coverage on the point defense layer. The point defense degradation lasted 31 seconds before the carrier Growler element completed its reallocation and restored coverage. In those 31 seconds, the Pantsir S-1 battery positioned at the northern edge of the access road network, a system that the North Koreans had acquired through a procurement channel that the intelligence community had assessed as closed, but that had apparently not been closed, activated its radar on the frequency band that the lead Growler had deprioritized. The Pantsir's radar produced 4 returns from the B-2's airframe in those 31 seconds. 4 returns at the B-2's radar cross-section profile against a Pantsir fire control radar did not constitute a weapons quality track. They constituted an anomaly. The Pantsir operator reported the anomaly. The report traveled up the North Korean Air Defense Command chain at a speed determined by the specific communications architecture of the Paektu sector, which routed traffic through a relay station on the ridgeline before it reached the sector commander's console. The relay station added 11 seconds to the transmission time. The sector commander received the report at 1:23 a.m. and 44 seconds. He assessed it, looked at the jamming his sector was experiencing across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, and made a decision that reflected 40 years of training in a system that had been telling him for 40 years that the Americans were coming. He issued an immediate sector alert and authorized all batteries to activate fire control radars and engage any contact above the minimum engagement criteria. The activation order produced a cascade of electromagnetic events that the B-2's passive warning receiver classified, logged, and displayed in the order of their threat priority. The pilot looked at the display. He counted 7 active fire control emitters across 3 weapon system types. He looked at the release point on his navigation display. He was 4 minutes and 12 seconds from the initial point. He looked at the threat display again. He looked at the navigation display. He flew the aircraft. The mission commander transmitted the contingency code on the datalink, the code that activated the full suppression package, the reserve capability that the mission planners had held back from the primary EW protocol for exactly this scenario. The reserve package consisted of 2 F-22 Raptors that had been flying a holding pattern at the edge of North Korean airspace since 1 a.m., each carrying a loadout of AGM-88 anti-radiation missiles that had not been part of the pre-mission briefing to the crews of the B-2s because the planners had assessed that knowledge of the reserve asset would change how the primary crews managed their risk tolerance in ways that might compromise the mission's stealth profile. The F-22s received the activation code and crossed into North Korean airspace at supersonic speed, their radar warning receivers mapping the active fire control emitters that the B-2's datalink had already characterized. The first AGM-88 was in the air at 1:24 a.m. and 9 seconds. The Pantsir battery that had detected the anomaly took the first hit at 1:24 a.m. and 31 seconds. Its fire control radar, which was the active emitter that the missile had been tracking, was rendered inoperable. The battery's crew was uninjured. The battery's ability to engage aircraft was not. The KN-06 battery on the eastern ridgeline, which had been suppressed by the Growler reallocation but not eliminated, registered the AGM-88 launch signatures and shut down its radar immediately, as its crew had been trained to do. The shutdown created a hole in the long-range coverage at the precise moment that the lead B-2 reached the initial point. The weapons bay doors opened at 1:25 a.m. The first GBU-57 released. The aircraft rose 700 feet in the moment of separation, the pilot correcting the pitch with the same smooth input that the recovery from this specific weapons mass always required, and turned onto the egress heading before the bomb bay doors finished closing. The lead aircraft was done. What happened next was the trail aircraft's mission. The trail B-2 had been flying 4 minutes behind the lead since the Guam departure. Its mission commander had monitored the entire engagement sequence on the datalink with a specific kind of attention that comes from knowing that the sequence you are watching is the prelude to your own. He had watched the KN-06 anomaly, the Growler reallocation, the Pantsir activation, the contingency code transmission, and the F-22 suppression strikes. He had not spoken. There was no one to speak to in the protocol they were flying. When the lead aircraft's weapon release confirmation appeared on his datalink at 1:25 a.m., he began his final pre-release checklist. He was 3 minutes and 40 seconds from the initial point. The air defense sector was in partial chaos. Some emitters shut down, some destroyed, some still active on frequencies that the Growlers were managing, and the F-22s repositioning for secondary engagement tasking. The trail aircraft's penetration was happening through a network that was damaged, alert, and still partially functional. That was the scenario the planners had accepted when they built the two-aircraft package. It was the scenario he was now flying. The Trail B-2 crossed the initial point at 1:28 a.m. and 41 seconds. The weapons bay opened. The second GBU-57 released, following the penetration channel that the first weapon had opened 17 minutes earlier into the granite of the Paektu Massif. The modified fuzing algorithm, computed against the specific rock density profile of the channel, counted deceleration pulses through the altered geology of the first weapon's cavity and drove the weapon deeper than the first had reached. The fuse threshold was met at a depth that placed the detonation inside the primary chamber of the underground facility. The overpressure that the surrounding rock transmitted into the chamber was not what the chamber's designers had calculated against. They had calculated against a weapon detonating above them. The weapon had detonated among them. The surface above the primary chamber subsided 3 centimeters in the 40 seconds following the detonation. The seismic monitors at the Chinese station at Mudanjiang, 160 miles northeast, registered a 2.4 magnitude event that the duty seismologist noted and continued to monitor for aftershocks. None came. The event was isolated, sharp, and directional in a way that natural seismic events in the region were not. He noted that observation in his log and filed it under anomalies pending review. He would not be the last person to note the anomaly. The two B-2s were 340 miles into their egress when the facility's surface garrison registered the loss of contact with the underground complex. The garrison duty officer attempted every communications channel available to him in sequence with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood what he was dealing with and was executing his protocol precisely because executing his protocol was the only thing he could do. Every channel returned silence. At 2:09 a.m., he sent a runner, a physical human messenger, into the primary access tunnel with instructions to proceed to the first internal checkpoint and report the status of the blast doors. The runner returned at 2:23 a.m. He reported that the access tunnel was passable to the first checkpoint. He reported that the first checkpoint blast doors were intact. He reported that the passage beyond the first checkpoint was not passable. The runner was experienced enough to describe what he had seen without requiring technical language. The tunnel beyond the first checkpoint had moved. Not collapsed, moved as though the mountain had shifted on its foundation and the tunnel had moved with it. He estimated the passage was blocked for a distance he could not see the end of. The duty officer transmitted his report at 2:26 a.m. The chain of command that received it would spend the next 6 hours attempting to determine the scope of what had happened. The intelligence community that monitored those communications began building its assessment from the intercepts at 2:31 a.m. The assessment, when it was complete, confirmed what the mission package had projected with 91% confidence. The 9% had not materialized. The numbers when the package closed. 4 hours and 51 minutes of flight time for both aircraft. 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators employed in a 3-minute interval. 2 AGM-88 anti-radiation missiles employed by F-22 contingency assets activated mid-mission. 1 Pantsir battery fire control system rendered inoperable. 1 KN-06 battery forced into shutdown by anti-radiation missile threat. 0 B-2 aircraft lost. 0 crew members from the strike package. 1 underground facility housing the primary assembly and maintenance infrastructure for intercontinental-range ballistic missile systems rendered permanently inoperable. The mountain remained. What the mountain had been made to protect was gone. Deterrence is not the absence of threat. It is the demonstrated willingness to reach through any barrier, at any distance, at any depth, and remove the threat at its source, before it becomes the catastrophe that deterrence exists to prevent. The mountain did not make the weapons inside it permanent. It made them feel permanent. There is a difference, and on a morning in the darkness above the Paektu Massif, that difference was settled with a finality that no declaration, no treaty, and no negotiation had been able to achieve. The deep places are not safe. They are only deep.